Hi everyone. I mentioned in a video a few months back that I'd made some big changes in my personal life and had started a PhD program here in Portugal. So now the first academic year is finished. I've been learning some research techniques, how to organize theory and analysis, and doing some small studies on different parts of the coffee value chain, and all the while organizing and planning how my thesis is going to take shape. So I finished that proposal now, based on the first year of research, and I have to present this to a jury on Monday. So I'm here practicing this presentation. I thought I might as well share it with you all, in case anyone's interested in seeing what I've been up to. This is a study about falling coffee farmer income over the last 30 years, increased farmer poverty and displacement, and the role of buyer power in that shift. So why are we talking about coffee in this case? Coffee is an exaggerated archetype. It has characteristics in common with other products, but it's a particularly extreme version of a post-colonial smallholder production industry and its interaction with a completely globalized trade. It's a colonially established production system and division of labor. It's not set up to be a good business for farmers. Rather, it's set up to supply the colonial metropolis with something that it wanted. It is almost all grown by low-resource smallholder farmers in the global south, and it is mostly traded and processed by transnational companies headquartered in the local north. When faced with the issues of this value chain, mainstream propositions that you hear normally in the industry revolve around voluntary redistribution of income, as well as calls on farmers to upgrade in value chains in order to create a better situation for themselves. The purpose of this study, on the other hand, is to open up possibilities based on alternative explanations and assumptions as to how we got here. The research problem is the marginalization of coffee farmers. I've said it before in the book, but this comes down to declining terms of trade received by coffee farmers, a declining share of the consumer price, declining real prices that are being perceived by farmers. This, of course, is accompanied by increased poverty, marginalization, displacement, and somehow has coincided with increasing downstream profit rates. Most of the academic and industry literature on these issues, on the coffee value chain and value chain development in general, relies on neoclassical explanations of the dynamics. Most of this material assumes a certain faith in the market to regulate itself, and a lot of the programs that have come out of this literature to try to address these issues of smallholder farmer poverty have not been especially effective. They've focused on treating symptoms, considering these the problems themselves, and overlooking the possibility that the real problem may be something deeper that's causing these symptoms to occur. There are, of course, heterodox proposals out there, considering different assumptions, but a lot of what's available has been applied fairly anecdotally and has not yet been taken seriously by the industry, by consumers, by policymakers. I spend a lot of time talking with folks in the industry, and I keep pretty well up to date on what's going on, and all of the programming that I see from the companies themselves, of course, their corporate social responsibility and nonprofits and whatnot, action on the part of consumers and retailers, even government aid and multilateral assistance has focused overwhelmingly on redistribution and some notion of upgrading, supposing that if farmers just make a better product, they will automatically be compensated for it, and basically putting the responsibility on them to improve their own situation versus recognizing that something's out of balance fundamentally. The research question is, how can these things have coincided? How can we explain that the terms of trade and income of farmers around the world has decreased for the last 30 or 35 years, while the profit rate of downstream industry has only increased? This is not about finding someone who's to blame, that they did it, it's their fault. The world is not as simple as that. I'd like to explore what kind of changes or progression explain this concentration of rent. Whatever changes that have led here, intentional or not, I think it's important to understand the nature of these. Are these intentional structural changes that were made for the purpose of accumulating rent? Are these natural occurrences, as the neoclassicist would have us believe? Are these structural in nature? Are they institutional? A lot of times in these kind of discussions, we get past the idea that it's one group's fault or another group's fault, and kind of just determine that, well, it's the system. And okay, maybe there's some validity to that, but we can't just stop there. What is it about this system that marginalizes smallholder farmers and benefits downstream processors? And how did it get the way it is? My hypothesis is that declining terms of trade is a result of the leveraging of market power by the powerful actors who have been able to use it to increase their rate of accumulation. This is a result of the ability to influence the terms of exchange. It's about the ability to gain and leverage power based on differential access to or monopolization of key resources needed to operate in this value chain, and to influence the institutions that determine how rent is distributed among the actors. Like I said, this isn't as simple as downstream actors increase their accumulation by, force. I hypothesize that this is quite a lot more elegant, that this is about powerful actors monopolizing resources, about influencing institutions in a way that increases their own bargaining power, who are subsequently able to increase their own rate of accumulation by, one, direct bargaining, and two, by influencing the rules of the game that determine the distribution of rent. This, of course, does not occur in a vacuum. This process is mediated or catalyzed by a set of factors, including the colonial division of labor, capital, and social status in coffee production countries, about the liberalization of trade, finance, and investment that has allowed transnational companies to behave with a certain level of global transience, and the financialization of commodities trading itself. The theoretical framework that's going to be applied in this study is essentially the dependency theory research program. Now, that's quite a broad field with a lot of diversity in it. So in this case, I'm going to focus on the neo-Marxist branch. And while that, of course, includes a whole other set of definitions and positions, essentially what's going to be most key here is recognizing the polarizing nature of capitalist development due to monopoly capitalism and unequal exchange. That's basically to say that I'm rejecting the notion that there is perfect competition, recognizing rather that there is imperfect competition, and that these social relations between actors in this value chain are able to determine basically who wins and who loses, influencing terms of trade. I've chosen this theoretical framework in order to analyze relationships between the value chain nodes as the determinants of rent concentration. Two key concepts that are going to be applied here are bargaining power and an unequal exchange. Bargaining power being the asymmetric influence over the terms of trade, and influenced by some actors more than others over the distribution of value chain profits. And similarly, unequal exchange being the systematic deviation of labor value and productivity from the exchange value of the product being sold. In other words, deviating rates of accumulation by different actors in the value chain. Given the theoretical backing, let's get into more of the practical side of this. As I mentioned briefly before, this is not going to be as simple as one cause and effect, this group doing that to that other group. Rather, I'm going to try to take a much more nuanced look at this, basically with three levels of analysis. The first level being the basic relationship that's being studied by this entire thesis. It's on one hand the concentration of downstream bargaining power, and what connection this may have to the increased rate of accumulation by those downstream actors. Not being such a simple cause and effect relationship to be analyzed and proven, I'm going to be focusing on mediating factors. This brings us to level 2, the structures, mechanisms, and the institutions through which these are related. How is bargaining power amassed and applied to value chain counterparts in order to increase the rate of accumulation through certain structures and mechanisms based on the rules of the game? This is what I mean by folks in the industry saying, well, it's just the system, or my hands are tied, or that's just how it works. How exactly does it work? What exactly are these rules that they have to be followed that lead to such asymmetrical outcomes? But we're not finished there. Going down to level 3, how then are these structures, mechanisms, and institutions influenced? How have they changed over time, and who has that benefited? What are the shifts that have permitted this concentration of bargaining power, which has then been translated into differential rates of accumulation. One mediating factor is the increasingly unequal access to key resources needed to operate in this value chain, including financial capital, financial services, quality measurement ability, and quality definition. The structural shifts that have mediated this include the financialization of trading and the concentration of buyers. Secondly, control over pricing and term-setting institutions, which has, of course, concentrated with the downstream actors, who are quite concentrated, while farmers are quite fragmented. Mediating these shifts has been the financialization, which has in some ways caused the next one here, concentration of buyers. Fewer larger companies with greater access to financial capital have dominated, as well as liberalization of trade, finance, and investment, allowing transnational companies to operate within producing countries, stripping away producer country institutions that used to in some way control prices. And of course, there are many examples. And lastly, increasing substitutability of farmers by downstream actors of the value chain, which has to do with the concentration of the buyers themselves. Fewer buyers, same amount of farmers. Those few buyers have more options to get the coffee they need, as well as the liberalization again, which has allowed this to happen. These very concentrated buyers to operate closer and closer to the most vulnerable smallholder farmers. So how am I going to show whether any of this is actually going on? The idea is to break this into 3 studies. The first one on coffee futures. The question is whether the KC mild Arabica future contract, or the C price, has been reflective of physical fundamentals of this product, and if not, how has the future contract deviated from them? My hypothesis, as you may have guessed, is that the C price, or KC future, has underestimated the price that would have been otherwise indicated by physical fundamentals, allowing buyers or processors to reduce their cost of goods sold. I hypothesize that this indicator has moved in relation to non-tenderable coffee products. Asymmetric access to this derivative market and hedging products that you can find on it has allowed downstream actors to reduce their cost of goods, their cost of green coffee, and has effectively shifted risk toward producers and upstream actors who do not have the ability to hedge with it. Now, the ability to hedge, even though it's not available to everyone along the value chain, is quite important to the people that do have access to it. So there's strong interest in maintaining this system, even though it doesn't work very well for the majority of people involved in coffee. So how exactly am I going to answer this question? Through econometric analysis. And this is going to have 3 stages. First, I'm going to create a predictive pricing model based on fundamental and pricing data from a past era before technical speculation dominated futures trading and before non-tenderable coffee qualities dominated the coffee trade itself. I will apply this predictive model to the subsequent period in order to see how much this price has deviated from what physical fundamentals would have indicated based on the way this market used to work. In the second step, I'll do a different regression analysis, basically attributing the physical fundamentals of tenderable qualities as well as non-tenderable qualities to the future price in order to determine whether the fundamentals of these non-tenderable qualities with lower cost of production have a statistically significant effect on the future price. And lastly, regardless of the fundamentals of tenderable or non-tenderable products, I'm interested to see whether there's additionally a downward trend not explained by either one. The second study will focus on specialty quality or differentiated sensory quality and how different quality levels affect the distribution of rent along the chain. The perceived problem is that specialty coffees become an important part of the overall coffee market, and it commands significantly higher prices than commercial coffee to consumers. What separates these types of coffee is the sensory quality of the green coffee, the raw material, which is necessarily created only by farmers. Nevertheless, despite the existence of specialty coffee and that most of the coffee from a lot of areas is making its way only into specialty channels, the situation of a lot of smallholder farmers seems not to have changed much at all. So the question is, does upgrading quality allow farmers to improve their standing in the value chain? Or does it just create more scope for downstream actors to extract from them? My hypothesis is that downstream actors do capture a significant portion of the differential productivity or sensory quality that is created only by farmers. In other words, there is unequal exchange. I'm going to analyze the potential existence of this phenomenon through a pass-through analysis of specific lots of coffee. So, particular lots that exist, that farmers produce, that are sold, and that can be tracked from that farm up into the consumer or the retail outlet that ends up selling them. Knowing what the price is at each of these stages, at each of these 4 stages, between farmer and exporter, exporter and importer, which is the international transaction, importer roaster, and roaster selling wherever they're selling. So we're going to regress price on the farm produced quality in order to study this relationship, and whether the farm produced quality increases the gross margin of any of the other actors in addition to the farmers, which theoretically it should not, based on the neoclassical assumption that value add equals value capture. So in studying this relationship, we're going to include covariates. In other words, we're going to control for the origin and destination countries, the size of the farm, as well as the buyer type. And based on this analysis, we'll be able to tell whether farm-created quality is fully remunerated at the farm level, or if it has a positive effect on the gross margin of other actors who are not responsible for creating it. The final study evaluates structural and institutional changes and statuses of different production countries and how this may affect the distribution of rent along the value chain involving them. So the perceived problem is that declining terms of trade that are experienced by farmers have coincided with liberalization, the centralization of downstream links, meaning that traders and processors are larger and more concentrated compared to farmers than they were before, as well as countless global value chain development programs and all kinds of aid programs to increase productivity, quality, access to markets, etc. So my question is, have these structural factors that have permitted increasingly imbalanced bargaining power along the value chain facilitated the extraction of rent by downstream actors? And my hypothesis is that yes, terms of trade do favor downstream value chain actors, buyers, processors, traders, when conditions could permit them to gain bargaining power by forming bottlenecks. This power is used to capture incremental surplus when they have it at the expense of smallholder farmers. So how am I going to analyze whether this is going on or not? This is going to be another regression, this time of price on potential sources of seller or buyer power by country, controlling for quality. While the last time we focused on price versus quality, controlling for a bunch of other factors, this time we're going to control for quality because we're not interested in how quality affects price. We're interested in these institutional and structural factors, what role they may have to play in determining the outcomes for farmers versus others in the chain. And the main ones we're going to look at using different proxy variables are relative size of sellers versus buyers, farmers versus whoever they're selling to, be it larger farmers, cooperatives, local intermediaries, or massive transnational trading companies. Second, liberalization, which dictates the level of transnational trader participation in the value chain, whether they're allowed to operate in the production country, whether they're allowed to get quite close and buy directly from tiny farmers, or whether they must go through national exporters or a chain with however many actors in it. And finally, the urgency of producers to sell coffee versus buyers to buy it, and the substitutability of farmers for buyers. Well, I hope this whole thing really doesn't sound too negative, because it's not my intention at all. Really, I'm quite hopeful about what this project may open up in the future. Through this study, I hope that we can better understand and draw attention to a potential root of the marginalization that's quite inconvenient for the industry to hear about, but I think is necessary if we're going to move past just simply treating symptoms and start to make any kind of permanent change. I hope that through this we can disprove some of the mainstream orthodox assumptions about the dynamics of this value chain and make space for new propositions that include redistribution of power and don't just simply trust the market as it is to ensure social and environmental justice. I'm convinced that the coffee value chain can work in a way that does not systematically marginalize smallholders. However, I suspect that getting there will necessarily involve disrupting the status quo power structure, and that won't be a welcome change. But in order to know how to move forward, we must understand the current dynamics and how they came to be the way they are. This understanding, to be able to open up space for new propositions, of which I have many, is the goal of this project. So thanks for sticking around to the end. I've already made some progress on these things, and I'll try to make some videos about what I've uncovered so far, and I'll keep you all in the loop as this thing develops. Thanks.